traditional and ancestral territories of the Qwuloolt First Nation. And I am very pleased to welcome Melissa Gobin and Michelle Bahnick from the Tulalip Tribes, who will be speaking about the Qwuloolt Estuary Restoration Project. Melissa Gobin is a Tulalip Tribe citizen and the Natural Resource Outreach Education Coordinator. Learning and teaching about the ecosystems of the Salish Sea is Melissa's passion. Tulalip has a rich connection to the Salish Sea, and Melissa is one of many Tulalip citizens committed to protecting it. Education and outreach has given Melissa an outlet to teach kids, adults, and the broader community about the world we live in and the tribe's long-standing cultural connection to it. Michelle Bahnick is the wetland biologist for the Tulalip Tribes of Washington Natural and Cultural Resources Division. They are excited to further develop and refine the wetland program to preserve, protect, enhance, restore, and manage wetlands for the benefit of the Tulalip Tribes. Michelle grew up in the Pacific Northwest and has always been fascinated by ecosystems where water and land meet, as well as the connection and interactions between human communities and the ecosystems we live in. This session will take us on the historical journey of the Qwuloolt Estuary, including how the restoration project happened and finding some current monitoring efforts. And I'm super excited to now pass it off to Melissa and Michelle.
All right. Hi, I'm Melissa Gobin. I'm the Outreach Education Coordinator here for Tulalip Tribes. And this is Michelle Bahnick. This is our wetland biologist. And we're going to be talking about the intertidal wetland restoration in the Snohomish Estuary and the Qwuloots. The presentation that's about Tulalip Tribes of Washington, the history of the change, lessons learned throughout Qwuloots specific, Qwuloots and Smith Island costs, estuary monitoring, next steps, and then we'll have questions at the end. Tulalip Tribes of Washington is successors in interest to the Snohomish, Snoqualmie, Skykomish, and other allied bands, signatory to the 1855 Treaty of Point Elliott. And we want everybody to know that Indigenous knowledge is a gift, not a right. Don't assume people will give you the information just because you ask for it. We want it to be balanced between the knowledge of sharing and protecting sovereignty and the resources. Don't assume you can share the information without asking and without knowing the information is sensitive to our people and the risks of sharing the information. Qwuloots is our ancestral homeland since time immemorial. Qwuloots, which means marsh and Lushootseed, is home to many different plants and animals that we used for different cultural purposes. This was cut off for over 100 years, and we lost a lot of the natural plants that would help feed animals and the fish in the estuary. With the breach, we can see most of these coming back to our lands and helping the wildlife flourish once again. The area of Qwuloots was a valued place for fishing and fish camps, hunting of birds and mammals, gathering of native plants for basketry, culinary and medicinal uses. With Qwuloots back in its natural state, we have had opportunities to learn about the unique harvesting techniques and the history of the land. Now I'll pass it over to Michelle.
Okay. All right. So here we have a map showing the historic wetland condition of the Snohomish River Estuary from around 1860. It had a whole lot of estuary and emergent wetlands, estuary and scrub-shrub, going into riverine tidal, scrub-shrub forested, and scrub-shrub, sorry, up to palustrin scrub-shrub. Then we also have a map showing the loss of wetlands in the Snohomish River Estuary between 1941 and 1953, which ultimately came out to about 85% loss of the historical tidal marsh. It is worth noting that there's a couple different ways of measuring how tidal marsh was lost, like if mudflats are included or not, because those can also be significantly impacted. But most studies get 85 to 90% loss of historic tidal marshes. Here we have a similar map showing more of where the saltwater was specifically. So hopefully you can see my little laser pointer there, but we have a cutoff here between the freshwater and the various levels of salt water in the area. And this map also shows more of present day conditions, and within the square or in the rectangle is where most of the restoration of the Snohomish Estuary has occurred so far. That one. So let's talk about Qwuloolt itself. So you can see the Qwuloolt Estuary restoration site circled in red up here, or outlined in red would be more accurate. So historically, this area was tidal marsh and forest scrub-shrub habitat, which was interlaced by tidal channels, mudflats, and streams. Prior to the levee breach in August 2015, for over 100 years, the project area had been cut off from natural influences from the Snohomish River and the Salish Sea tides, primarily by levees, but also drained by ditches instead of stream channels. It was characterized by a monoculture of invasive reed canary grass instead of native shrubs and grasses. So this location specifically was picked for a couple of different reasons, but primarily it was identified as a target area in the Snohomish Estuary Wetland Integration Plan. And it was also targeted by a natural resources damage assessment to help replace some of the habitats lost at the Tulalip landfill Superfund site, also called Big Flats, which is right here with the black arrow. There's that one. The funding from the Superfund site actually helped pay for a good chunk of the first parts of the Qwuloolt Estuary for purchasing parcels. And it became part of a much larger project than just what the Superfund funding was for. So the primary purpose of the Qwuloolt project was to restore critical habitat for Chinook salmon, like these little baby ones in here. So the Snohomish Estuary and the Qwuloolt area specifically is a high-use sub-basin within the Snohomish River Basin, right over here. So it's used as a transition zone for both adults and juveniles as they're going between freshwater and saltwater. And in the 2005 Snohomish Basin Salmon Conservation Plan, it was hypothesized that the quality and quantity of rearing habitat in the estuary is one of the primary factors limiting Chinook and bull trout char in the Snohomish River Basin. So that's a big part of why this area was picked for the restoration. Additionally, the Qwuloolt site itself improved fish passage to 16 miles of upstream spawning and rearing habitat as well through the creeks that actually run through Qwuloolt. And here's an interesting little project area context. So here we have the 1938 early effects of ditching, diking, draining, and agriculture. And then we have 2003 next to it, which we can still see a lot of the impacts. This, I believe, was used to raise cattle for a long time. And then we have 2014, which is just before the levee was breached. And so, yeah, you can actually see a lot of the effort that was put in with remeandering stream channels and all of that. So something to think about is Qwuloolt project took a lot longer than we thought it would. It actually took 20 years to complete from planning to the levee breach, which was pretty humbling. Overall, we were hoping that it would not take quite so long. So why bother doing a project that takes 20 years to even implement? So a big part of it was restoring the tidal wetlands and channels to provide that critical habitat for salmon rearing and staging. And as mentioned earlier, is improving fish passage to upstream spawning and rearing habitat as well. And it also provided water quality improvements. So just another little picture showing where Qwuloolt is relative in the estuary, which goes into part of why this was such a complicated project. Is Qwuloolt is about 400 acres large. So that takes a lot of time to scope, permit, and design. Additionally, permitting always takes longer than expected, and it can be very frustrating and complicated, especially when you get permit appeals that can slow down a lot of the project. And this particular project included permitting from the federal government, the state, city of Marysville, which is inside or where Qwuloolt is within, and all that. So here's a timeline of the project. So planning was basically 1995 to 2012. Property acquisition and easements actually took basically the entire time up until the breach of the levee. Permitting and design was also about 5 years, or permitting was about 5 years. Interior construction was also about 5 years. And then setback levee construction was about 3 years. And then the levee breach was relatively quick compared to all the rest of it. So one of the big things that we ran into was property acquisition. So this occurred from 1994 essentially through 2015. And it can be pretty complex. So here is an image of property ownership at the Qwuloolt site in 2010. And so you can see in green, most of the site is owned by the tribe, but a bunch of it is also owned by the city of Marysville. We have an advanced mitigation site over in here. The city was also really wanting to have a walkway on the side, so they have a lot of those parcels. But there's also still some private ownership, especially up near the top, which also makes it a little bit complicated for designing the project. So about 55 parcels or easements were purchased. 32 landowners were contacted. And as a note, the tribal owned parcels are fee simple. So that can, in some cases, have implications for restoration projects, but in this case, it hasn't been detrimental at all. So there were a lot of lessons learned with this project, or any project of this scope, really. So the largest costs are generally associated with protection of public and private infrastructure and property. For example, installing rock to protect somebody's house, as well as improving the well. Understanding site conditions is also a large component, such as understanding how groundwater moves through the site is there, which leads into designing appropriate water management measures. So in one case, there was an area that had staging for levee and construction material. This was on wetland soils, which compacted, which made a lot of the levee material wet, and you can't actually use wet material to construct a levee. So then it became how much was lost, how much could we save, and how much more did we have to bring in. And here we have hydrodynamic modeling, which really helped with the planning for the Qwuloolt site. So the blue is water movement or water, and the black arrows, you can't really tell if they're arrows probably, but those are showing vectors of water movement. So where it's really thick black lines forming is a lot of water moving through. All right, so there are a couple different restoration actions that occurred. So some of these included doing levee construction along the side. So that was to protect existing infrastructure. There's also a stormwater pond had to be moved and put over here. There's also these wave attenuation berms that form throughout, and that was actually to prevent the waves being too big or having too much wind action affecting wave height on the north end of Qwuloolt, and that's again more of protecting infrastructure. That on the southern end, we also had things like removing the tide gate that was done on site, as well as actually breaching the levee and also constructing channels so that it would connect to where the breach occurred. Yeah, there was also replant or adding about 10 acres of riparian plantings as well. And lowering the levee by about 2 feet across here where the yellow is. So overall, about 354 acres of wetland or riparian area were restored. Basically, this broke down to about $21 million for the entire project, and that included property acquisition, planning, permitting, and design, as well as construction. And it's worth noting that the setback levee construction and the levee removal were about 50% of the project cost by themselves. So we imported around 155,000 cubic yards and used around 140,000 cubic yards for the levees, which was about 14,000 truckloads. So lots of material was moved for this project. With that, about 12 million of the dollars, or $12 million in funding, were from different grants. To include that, the NRDA fund that's up here is from the super fund allocation. So yeah, basically shortly after the levee was breached and later on down as well, kayakers actually started going into the Qwuloolt site. Which is pretty exciting, except as you may remember from the hydrological modeling, is if you're there when the tide is going in or out, there's a lot of water moving through that breach. So that's something to note. Yep, and so there's quite a bit of estuary monitoring that's happening. Tulalip has been monitoring the estuary since around 2006, partnering with NOAA, in the Seattle office, and working with Snohomish County as well. In 2010, NOAA wrote a monitoring plan that has been guiding the monitoring of the estuary ever since. So there's a bunch of different types of monitoring that are conducted annually. There's vegetation for what plants are coming in. There's sedimentation rates, bathymetry, water quality, including salinity, dissolved oxygen, and temperature. Fish, looking at what types, densities, and distributions, as well as birds and what the foraging guilds are. So for vegetation monitoring, as a note, remember that before the breach, the site was a reed canary grass monoculture. There wasn't really much else out there. So it's not really all that surprising that we started off with a lot of mudflats once saltwater began flowing in and out of the site. It did take a couple years after the breach for the reed canary grass to finally die off. And as a note, no planting was performed other than in riparian areas and on the wave attenuation berms. So this is 2017, lots of mudflats all up in the middle there. What we were surprised by is in 2019, a lot of the area was actually vegetated, at least somewhat vegetated. The edges are a lot more fully vegetated, which isn't surprising because a lot of the vegetation is driven by elevation. So the higher areas around the edges are more likely to be highly vegetated. But we're ultimately hoping to see increased accretion rates or increased amounts of sediment moving in, which would be due to vegetation trapping suspended sediment in the water. And we want the accretion or deposition because it's better for plant establishment, which in turn is better for the insects that then the juvenile salmon eat while they're in Qwuloolt. There's also been monitoring of changes in bathymetry. So here we have a pretty high tide and the levee breach. And here's what the bathymetry looks like. So Ebby Slough is usually around 12 feet deep, but the water velocities coming out of Qwuloolt created an outlet pool that's about 25 feet deeper than the original channel bed. So you can actually see it in the dark blue there. Sorry, everything's in meters in the photo. Dissolved oxygen was also really low for the first couple of months due to the high organic load in the water, but that's basically cleared up. Then we've also had changes in avian foraging guilds, which I find really fascinating. So 2012 through 2015, not a whole lot happening there. There's an average of like, maybe around less than 10 birds per visit for each guild. Then the breach happened. It's still pretty low in 2016, and then it spikes following those years. So pretty interesting that the birds, once things had a moment to kind of recover a little bit, were jumped right back in. So here's just a quick look back at the historic condition one more time with Qwuloolt added right up here. So you can see what it is. So we were hoping to get a lot more scrub-shrub wetland coming back and some forested wetland coming back. So far, it looks like we're mostly having emergent wetlands, which might just be how the condition's going to be now, but we'll continue monitoring to find out. There's also average juvenile Chinook salmon densities for the Qwuloolt site in here. So we have the inside is inside of Qwuloolt. There's also reference blind. So the blind channels are the tidal channels that don't actually have an end, but they're an important spot for while the tide is going in and out. And the ref disc is looking actually in the channel, like in Ebby Slough. So overall, this is between 2016 and 2019. And you can see that the numbers are getting back up to pretty normal or pretty close to some of the reference sites. It is worth noting that it generally follows the trend seen throughout the area for Chinook, although there is a bit of a drop off on the inside earlier. And part of that is just due to the lack of overhanging vegetation, which means that the water gets warmer faster, and Chinook don't particularly like warm water. Something else worth noting, and this information came out in 2022, looking at the connectivity and where juvenile Chinook distribution is actually happening throughout the Snohomish Estuary. So you can see they're mostly occurring in areas 1, 2, and 3 here, and less so actually over where Qwuloolt is over in the 7. So there's just less fish coming through those areas. So maybe if we'd had this data, back when we were starting this project in between 1995 and 2015, there may have been an argument for trying to move the site to somewhere more in the lower area, where there's just a lot of salmon in need for habitat down there. All right, and so another interesting thing is the relative proportion of juvenile Chinook salmon from various different areas that are appearing in the lower Snohomish Estuary. So we do have Snohomish fish. We have, but there's also some Nooksack, there's Skagit. What I found really interesting is that there's even some hood canal fish. So they're going the wrong way. They're actually heading more inland than going out to sea as they're out migrating. But it's really interesting and exciting to see that juvenile Chinook really like the Snohomish Estuary as habitat. In next steps, so there's always more to do with restoration. A lot of the efforts still are based on the Snohomish Basin Restoration Plan, which was set in 2005. And here you can see what was intact in 2005, the 10-year target, and the total restored. Overall, we're doing, well, it's a mixed bag. Near shore beaches and shoreline, we're actually ahead of the target. while with estuary tidal marsh, we haven't hit that target. Same with restored edge habitat along the main stem. Restored riparian habitat is doing good. Restored off-channel habitat is not doing spectacularly compared to the target, while large woody debris has done very well overall. And it's worth noting on the large woody debris side that for Qwuloolt, we didn't actually install any large woody debris as part of the project, but it naturally recruited very heavily into the site. So sometimes nature helps you reach your goals. And another thing worth noting is there's a lot of restoration activity happening in the Snohomish Estuary. So we have Qwuloolt over here in the corner. Clearly this is at a high tide event. The Washington State Department of Transportation has a project over here. Smith Island, Spencer Island, Union Slough, Blue Heron Slough is actually a mitigation bank that is over here. That also had a dike breach. All been there, and so ones that are still incoming and future projects are the North Ebby over here, or EB, and Chinook Marsh, which is 475 acres down here. It's near the bifurcation of where the river splits. So this is an exciting area, which is a future project. And that's what we have. Say, I went really fast. Sorry about that.
Great. Thank you so much, Melissa and Michelle. This was really great. It was so amazing to see. I really got a sense of what a large scale this project was done on. So thanks so much for sharing your experiences with us. If you have questions, please share them in the chat. I saw a few here. Someone was asking, how was the reed canary grass removed? Was there any specific measures taken?
Yep. Nope. Jade answered that very well. Yeah, it's not very salt tolerant, so it's resistant. It tries really hard to live. But it did eventually succumb to flooding from the salt water. So
Perfect. Yeah, that makes sense. Great. Is there any visitor center that we could visit to learn more about the area and project?
So there's not so yes and no. So the city of Marysville has put in a really cool park on the southeast corner of Qwuloolt. Do you use Sunset Park?
I think it's called Sunset.
I think it's called Sunset Park. But it's really cool. Yeah, it has little park features, but it also goes down to the walkway. And you can actually walk on part of the breach or part of the levee that was breached. To see it, I love going out there.
The Hubald Cultural Center also here in Tulalip, they have some books and some historical information about Qwulooth also at the museum we have there.
Cool, great. Deborah asked, how has this restoration changed the lives of people in the region?
Oh, that's a big question. I mean, ultimately it's helping get more fish raised and reared and hopefully coming back as well. Yeah, no,
it seems like a lot of now that there's more vegetation and more of the different plants that we used to harvest, a lot more historical information is coming out about it. A lot more people coming out teaching us how to do the cattail mats or to how to harvest in all of the water coming back into it so that the salmon are there. I mean, I got to go out when I first started in natural resources and seeing how they're monitoring the salmon, seeing all of that and bringing the kids out there also. It's been awesome teaching them different stuff about the wetlands because I mean, that's where our salmon need to be before they come out, and, you know, that's a very critical habitat. And it was cut off for so long that it's just, it turned into dry nothingness or wet nothingness.
Caitlin is a restoration ecologist, watershed steward, and experienced program manager, born and raised on the traditional territory of the Salish-speaking peoples, now working in the unceded coastal Salish territory. Her love of the ocean is obvious, with 10 years dedicated to working and learning from marine and coastal environments throughout the Salish Sea. Caitlin's current goals for the Comox Valley include supporting and further community engaged stewardship to restore a thriving watershed. I'm happy to have Caitlin bring us up to date on this important watershed restoration project. So over to you, Caitlin.
Great, thank you so much. I'll just share my screen here. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for having me here tonight. It's really nice to get to talk to such a large group of people about our shared work and project. So as Sheila noted, my name is Caitlin Pierzchalski. I'm the Executive Director of Project Watershed, and I'm a marine biologist and restoration ecologist by training. But I've been in nonprofit leadership for a long time, and I've had the privilege of being Project Watershed's leader for the past 3 years while working on this beautiful project. So I'm here to talk today about our project, Kus-kus-sum. It's a partnership project between 3 different partners, the Comox First Nation, Project Watershed, and the City of Courtney. So here's just a quick overview of what we'll be going through today. I'll talk a little bit about who Project Watershed is and a little bit about the partner group, a little bit of the site history of the site kind of through time and where we're at today. I'll give you an overview of the project and the project goals, and then also the work carried out today. You're kind of catching us midway through the project. So lots of work has happened, but also lots of work is still to continue. I'll talk about the 2023-2024 planned works, some impacts from new legislation, some of the opportunities that come with that, and a little bit about land renaturation at the end. So Project Watershed is a nonprofit stewardship group. We've been a registered charity since 1993. We were originally established by a group of concerned citizens who were seeing increasing impacts to Comox Valley watersheds through development, resource extraction, and lots of other pressures that we see here locally, sometimes agriculture as well. So there was this intersection of stressors that was starting to affect the overall health of our watershed. So this group of folks came together and started taking action and doing works where they saw fit. The current focus of our expertise includes coastal, nearshore, and estuarine restoration and research. We also carry out forage fish research. And then we have a freshwater restoration focus as well. And then we also do collaborative and community-focused stewardship. So a lot of citizen science projects and monitoring efforts that really engage our community in the work that we do. So a little bit about the site. Kus-kus-sum is the restoration of an old sawmill site. So prior to its development, this is the first photo that we actually have of the site. Prior to that, because we're working with Comox First Nation, we are privy to some cultural knowledge and historical knowledge about the site prior to its development. But this is the first photo that we could actually find of the site. And it's an important photo for us because it is the site prior to its development as a sawmill. So the site was developed as a sawmill in 1949. It was historically a tidally influenced forested riparian habitat, as you can see here. It would have been a host to a stand of Sitka spruce trees. Those were historically used as burial trees, specifically in this area along the river and estuary. And that would have been a culturally significant site to the Comox First Nation as well. So it was developed as as a sawmill in 1949, and since that point has gone through various iterations of sawmill infrastructure development, and kind of this transition from a natural tidally influenced forested riparian habitat to fully functioning large sawmill with log boom infrastructure in front of it. And I'll show you some cool photos, and then kind of where we are today, where we're trying to shift it back to what it was previously. So this is one of the first images that we could find of the sawmill infrastructure. So as you can see, this is it back in early days, so probably just post 1949, where you have some of the old sawmill infrastructure. It's down at river level, and so you see some of the infrastructure here. That moved over that 50-year lifespan. So this is kind of the end of the lifespan of the sawmill site that you can see here. So you can see some of that really big, this was like the log processing site. You can see the booms out here. They had a shipping wharf and dolphin where they would load and unload logs as well. There was a big blooming pond here as well, just like large infrastructure. So this would have been kind of peak sawmill development back in late 80s, early 1990s. And then this was the end of life. So the sawmill was a successful sawmill, originally owned by the Field Sawmill family in 1949. It was bought and sold several times, and at the end of its lifespan as a sawmill, it was owned by a company called Interfor. Back in 2004, the sawmill was closed because one of the biggest exports of the site was yellow cedar. So there was less yellow cedar to harvest and export off the site. And so the sawmill facility was shut down due to economic reasons back in 2004. And then from 2004 to 2008, it went through a remediation process. So there were some contaminated soils on site. So Interfor was obligated through the regulations then to go in, remove the contaminated soil that was known about and identified, and just make sure there wasn't any longstanding contamination issues at the site. So this was what the site looked like when it went up for sale in 2011. And then I'll just remind everyone that this is what naturally functioning estuary looks like. This is just downriver, maybe 100 meters. So I just want to bring this idea back to people's kind of memories and to get you thinking about it, because this is actually an area of the estuary just south of the Courtenay River called the Hollyhock Flats. And the Hollyhock Flats is a really beautiful preserved landscape. It was conserved back in the 1980s when some folks were worried about ongoing estuary development. So it was bought by the province back then and has been conserved for ecological conservation specifically ever since then. So the values of, there's no kind of trails or anything. It's very like an undisturbed landscape in there. It's quite beautiful. And this is just downriver. So one of the goals of the restoration generally has been to look to Hollyhock Flats, see areas of healthy estuary, and really model our restoration works at the site on that. So some of the overarching project goals, there are many, and as you folks know, there are a lot of co-benefits that exist within restoration projects. So some of the core project goals were to restore ecological values of the site, reconnect the site to the floodplain and to the Courtenay River, which is the river that runs right here. There's also a really important partnership and reconciliation aspect to this project. So the land will be rematriated or returned back to the Comox First Nation after successful restoration. Obviously, there's climate change adaptation and mitigation benefits that are involved in this. And then there's also community resilience piece. So you can see a really big road here. This is Comox Road running right here. Downtown Courtenay is just across the river over here. So the site was actually modeled, the restoration is modeled to actually have flood prevention values in it. So that's that community resilience piece. You know, we often think about the ecological values of these sites when we're doing restoration, but there's also a really strong social and cultural component to these sites. So that's a little bit about what we're looking at. So actually, I'm just going to flick back, and I'm actually going to go kind of walk a little bit through the timeline for the project a bit. So some of the things that we've been thinking about as we look about think about the site. So this site was originally identified by Project Watershed as a possible restoration site when we did basically analysis of the entire Qwuloolt Estuary, looking at restoration opportunities, and specifically restoration opportunities that benefited juvenile Chinook. So as folks have been previously talking about in this conversation, which is so great, estuary habitat is really, really important to outmigrating Chinook. And so this site was identified as one of those sites that could potentially be restored, and that would really provide a lot of good rearing and foraging habitat for those young Chinook on their outmigration. So back in 2011, when the site was identified, it was the biggest project that Project Watershed had ever conceived of. So we did a lot of work with the community to understand whether this was actually something that folks wanted to see for the site. As you can see here, the site is very much like an eyesore, if you will. It's right there. It's across from the downtown in our community. And so it's just a really obvious feature. It's 8.3 acres, so it's a very large site. And it's a very prominent feature in our community. So we worked with our community to understand whether a restoration or a conservation solution for the site was of interest to our community. So we held a big estuary symposium. We did a lot of work bringing folks on board, and we have an MOU with Qwuloots First Nation that was actually established in 2011. So anytime we're thinking about a project, what we do is we bring it to the Qwuloots First Nation, and then it gives us like a really good advanced process for getting their buy-in, getting their understanding of whether they want to see this project go forward, and then what interested kind of contribution they would like to have as well. And so for this project, they said, we brought it to them and we said, this is what we're thinking about. What do you folks think? What would you like to see if we decide to proceed with this? And they loved the project. They thought it was a really great value added to our community. And actually just down the road here is the Qwuloots village and reservation. So what they were really keen to see, they were keen to partner with us on the project, and their big desire for the project was, yes, they want to have it restored back to its kind of pre-development condition, but also they'd like the land to be rematriated to them post-restoration. So that's been a really important value of this work. It's not just about restoration, it's about land back, it's about really there's just a justice component that's really important. You know, the land was originally appropriated back in 1949 to be used as a sawmill, and so this is an opportunity to not only return this site to nature, but return it to the traditional stewards as well. So that's a really important value of the project. So obviously, Indigenous partnership and collaboration was a really, really important aspect of what we did. So we engaged Qwuloots early, long before we were even thinking about how to fund the project or what that looked like. It's really about like speaking with our partners early, understanding what their desire is and how they'd like to, how we'd like to come up with shared principles that we can move forward together with. I think that relationship is really important. There's also an important reciprocity piece. So for example, we are bringing this project to Qwuloots, and Qwuloots has informed us that there's a really, really strong desire to see the land rematriated. That's great. We're happy to do that. So that's been a really, really great piece. But there's also been some like job creation and things like that. So making sure that for those kind of economic benefits piece, there's a really strong give back or training for the community as well. So that's been a really important principle for us to work with. We also have a principles of engagement document that really guides how we work together in a trust-based way with the Qwuloots First Nation and the city of Courtenay. when we started developing the project, we came up with some shared values of what we wanted to see. So I'll just remind you that these were some of the values we wanted to embody in the restoration. So one of the interesting things about a project like this is you basically have a bit of a moonscape, if you will. Like, as you can see, there's this really big steel piling wall. There's just 8.3 acres, concrete and asphalt, and they're leaving this old office building down here as well. So you're kind of starting from scratch. So there's this piece where, yes, we know a little bit about the site because we have that old aerial photography, but we actually don't know exactly what the site looked like pre-development. So there's a kind of understanding of, okay, what are our values? What do we want to reestablish at the site? And how much do we know about the site before we end up designing the restoration? So what we did is we looked at old aerial photos to try to understand any sort of pre-development state that existed. We also surveyed Hollyhock Flats to understand the elevation and the vegetations within the flats so that we could use that as a model. But then you can also look at your shared values here and try to model the restoration after that. So integrating all of those three big components, we came up with a proposal for what the final restoration design could look like. So it includes flood prevention, it includes climate change adaptation and mitigation, so being resilient to sea level rise, but also having a lot of carbon sequestration features through the various habitats that we've chosen. We've also identified a really strong importance of contributing to overall salmon stocks in the Courtney River, so specifically looking at Chinook. So there's a really big significance put on Carrick's levee sedge meadows. So there's a lot of marsh meadow, tidal marsh meadow habitat that's created. And that elevation is also strongly integrated. So there's a bunch of different values that go into this. And then when you work with your lovely team of hydraulic engineers, they can come up with some really cool models. So we did a couple of different models to show us how the site would actually fare in different conditions. So that's what I'm going to play for you here. This is the site without any restoration. So this is just that big flat surface covered in concrete. And then this is the restoration design here. So you have the higher back here. You have some deep water features, and then you have some tidal marsh bench habitat and a little tidal island here. And then this is the discharge of the Courtney River. So our site is both riverine and tidally influenced. So both of those things integrate together to dictate the overall water level at the site at any given point. And then this is just the tidal level at the Comox Harbor. So if I play this, just an important note that the deepest water is shown in blue and the shallowest sections are shown in red. So I press play here, you can see the discharge going up. You can see water flowing in and out of the site. So these are small events, and then you can see a bigger event and a flushing. And so this is based on a diurnal tide model. So you can see the site getting inundated twice daily as we go through these different events. And I believe this was at a winter high tide. So what we're seeing is even in high water conditions like BC here, the water is overtopping and flooding into these surrounding areas with a reminder that the road is just right here. Again, really quick. And this is just an example of a high winter flow event. So this is just a snapshot in that overall video. And you can see deep water here. You can see shallower depths along here. This is just a detailed drawing of the restoration design. Very similar. So we have this higher riparian berm here. And then as it starts to move towards the river here, then you start to lower towards those marsh habitats along this area. This is that tidal marsh island feature. And then this is the river here. So this is just a little mock-up of what the site will look like restored. It's a cross-section. So up here you see that upland habitat. So in that berm that kind of runs along the backside of the site, this is where you'd have a lot of those upland tidally influenced riparian habitat plants. So within this area, you'd be seeing things like Sitka spruce, crabapple, red alder, black hawthorn, twinberry, reddish or dogwood, Nootka rose and salmonberry. As you start to get like a little lower down here, that's when you start to see things cropping up like hardhack and small flowered bulrush. When you get into this area, that's when you get the sweet gale as well. We also have tufted hairgrass, springtime clover, meadow barley, sweet scented bedstraw. And then as you get a little lower, that's when we start to get some regionally rare species, which is really cool, like Henderson's checker mallow, which is doing wonderful on the site, which is really neat. We've got some of that potentilla and some asters. And then this kind of lower bench here, that's when you really start to see the lingby sedge. It looks like quite a small swath in this little mock-up here, but it's actually quite a wide swath, and I'll show you that in some of the photos that we have. And then closest to the edge here, that's when we have the some of the things like the glocks and the rush and the salicornia, and those are some of the species that are just on that leading edge with the river. So a lot of folks have come together to make this all possible. So we meet once a month with the overarching partner team. So this is just a little snapshot of the Kus-kus-sum partner group. It's been a really successful model for us to get everybody together, provide project updates. We have appointed staff and elected officials from all the partner groups. So we have the chief and a counselor from Comox First Nation. We also have one of their key staff liaisons as well. And then we have a counselor who you can see there from City of Courtenay and some of their chief staffers as well. And then here you can see our past staff biologist, Jennifer, and one of our board members as well. So it's a great opportunity for us to provide project updates, discuss relevant topics that relate to the project, do future planning together, and it's been a really great platform for solution-based thinking and collaboration. I think this is one of the things that's allowed us to be so successful. It gives us a very blocked out opportunity once a month to make sure we're all on the same page, thinking together and pulling in the same direction. So that's been a really wonderful aspect of the project. It's been a long time coming. So we originally formed the partner formation in 2016, the partner team formation in 2016. In 2017, we entered into an agreement with Interfor, who was the property owner at the time, and they agreed to basically enter into an agreement with us saying that they would sell us the site eventually once we'd raised the money in order to do that. So the site, the land acquisition was $3.2 million. We did not have that much money just sitting in the bank, so it took us a huge effort to be able to raise that much money. There was significant contributions from the province of BC, as well as from many community members, many grants, and businesses as well. It was a huge effort. It took us from 2017 until the end of 2020 to raise enough money. And so then in 2021, we actually successfully signed the Bear Trust Agreement and the land transfer that transferred the land from Interfor to Project Watershed to hold in trust for the two partners. So Project Watershed is currently holding the land in trust for the Comox First Nation and the City of Courtenay. And after restoration is complete, that's when we'll rematriate it to the Comox First Nation. So from 2020 to 2021, that was the focus of our work, is setting all those land purchase items in place. And then from 2021 to 2022, that's when we were able to really initiate restoration, get into the hard surface removal, so removing all the concrete and asphalt on the site and beginning the excavation. In 2022 to 2023, we did recontouring and revegetation. From 2023 to 2024, we did more recontouring and more revegetation. And then in 2025, this next fiscal year, we still have more recontouring and revegetation to do. But as early as maybe late 2025, we might be getting into the steel piling wall removal, which is at the front of the site. So here's some interesting photos, hopefully interesting photos of what it looks like to take a landscape that's kind of that industrial moonscape and to turn it back to nature. So you can see here, this is an excavator with a concrete breaker on the end. So it just basically smacks away the concrete, breaks it up. And then there's another cool thing. It's like an elephant presser foot. So it's this big round thing and it applies pressure and just cracks up the concrete. and then they're able to come in with the bucket and scoop it out. There was also various configurations of rebar, steel wire, and all sorts of stuff throughout the concrete. And the concrete was really varying in depth. This site was developed, before the construction standards that we have currently. So there was all sorts of weird depths of concrete pours and just free pours of concrete and all sorts of rebar configurations that we unearthed over time. So here is an example of our beautiful industrial landscape. We have huge piles of concrete. You can see some metal piled up here. They actually use this tire to put around that little breaker bit so that the small chips from the concrete didn't fly up. And that actually worked surprisingly well. It was very inventive. Here we have some more concrete and some asphalt here in the foreground. And then this is some of the metal we removed. So we removed 12,000 cubic meters of concrete crushed up. So we actually crushed it into 3-inch minus, which is just a size of crush. And then that material was actually able to be repurposed as fill all around the valley, which is really cool. It allowed us to actually reuse some of the debris, which is really important. I think a lot of these projects make a lot of waste at times. So we actually made a really dedicated effort to make sure we were trying to have as small of a waste footprint as we possibly could. So for the most part, most of the materials have either been recycled, reused, or repurposed. And that was the case with concrete crush, as well as with this metal. We had 76 of these bins of metal, so many bins, and 12,000 cubic meters of concrete. This is us crushing it up into that 3-inch minus. So we actually mobilized a crusher to the site and crushed it up. This is just trucks and trucks full of asphalt and concrete. And then this is the part where you start to really see it returning to something that you would identify as a natural landscape. So you come in with the excavator, you basically just do loads and loads of earth moving. So this is us doing some of those deeper excavations. This is an area that started to recontour. So this is looking from the bridge south down the site. This is us doing some planting. So we have some cute little conifers here, which is really exciting. This is the first planting effort that we did. So we've basically been restoring from the north end of the site where the 17th Street Bridge is and working our way south towards the estuary. This is that carex bench that I was talking about. So all these plants in pots, these are all carex lingby sage. So this is actually the width of that bench that you can see. It's pretty significant. And these are actually 40 participants who came out from a program called Ocean Bridge, which is an ocean-wise program. And they actually came all the way from the lower mainland to support the planting efforts. And I just want to note that all of the plants that have been put in the ground at Kus-kus-sum have been put in by the loving hands of community volunteers and staff team members and Comox First Nation members. So all of the planting has been done by community members, which I think is really cool. And every time we come out and we have one of these events, we're astonished by the number of people that care about this site enough to really come out and do really hard labor on behalf of it. And, they just do it because this is what they want to see for the site. They want to see conservation and ecological values and reconciliation values really focused in on and honed in our valley. And they wanted an example of. And so that's kind of what we're creating together, which is so cool. I love these planting events because it really feels like we're building something together with our community. So there's some more examples. You can see some gosh, every time I see some of the red flowering currant that we've planted on site, I'm just so impressed. It's just such a beautiful plant. If anyone ever needs to plant something native and aesthetically very pleasing, get yourself some red flowering currant. And then, so this is the kind of first, I'm just going to see back. These were kind of the first 2 phases. So we phased the project. The first one was hard surface removal. The second one was earthworks and revegetation. We're still in phase 2 of the project with this earthworks and revegetation. And that's what we'll be continuing with this field season. And then the field season after that, 2025, 2026, is when we'll be really talking about removing the steel piling wall. So this is the final stage of the restoration, is to come in with a barge with a crane on it and basically vibrate out those steel piling walls that have been in there since the 80s. So it's going to be working in partnership with Current Environmental, who are environmental monitors, DFO, who handle the permitting and approval, NHC, our engineers, and qualified contractors who have been doing these kinds of removals. We'll be doing it in the wintertime via a barge because the Courtney River is super shallow in the summertime. So we'll be coming in with a barge in the wintertime where there's the least risk to sort of having the barge on bottom, but also crush injuries to fish and other wildlife. So some of the construction environmental monitoring plan measures that will be in place for that work is sound habituation. So you basically start off the work really slow so that wildlife move out of the area, and also reducing sound wherever needed or possible. We'll also have turbidity and erosion control measures, as well as fencing off key areas with underwater structures so that wildlife aren't coming in and out of the work areas. So that's going to be a really challenging, very interesting part of the work. We'll be connecting the site back to the Courtney River once it's revegetated. And the preemptive piece of that is only after the whole site is revegetated and the vegetation is establishing really well, will we proceed with removing the wall. So that's kind of conditional on the vegetation establishing well and the rest of the work's getting finished. So in order to protect the environment, while we're doing environmental work, we have lots of measures in place, which include machine maintenance and monitoring, having biodegradable oils and fluids in the machines. We have a spill management protocol, as well as turbidity and erosion control. We also have ongoing water quality testing in the Courtney River upstream, downstream, and on-site. There'll be a soils testing component, which is going to be really important. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second here. The work timing is important, so we try to work in windows where there's the least possible impact to the environment. And then we also do dust suppression, which was particularly important during the concrete removal, but continues to be important in summer earthworks when it's really dry and dusty. So arc monitoring is also an important component on site. So especially during deep excavations, we make sure that there's a monitor on site. And we have all our cultural and cultural heritage permits and the chip permits in place. This is one of the KFN Guardians who's been providing us with archaeological monitoring support. So we're looking to, and through that work, we're looking to identify any cultural sediments or any kinds of remains, and there are protocols in place in case of those finds. So the site's not yet finished, but as noted in earlier presentations, king tides have very much been a thing. So one of the reasons that steel piling wall is in place is because as the sawmill kind of went through these various infrastructure iterations, it would flood all the time because it's right in the mouth of the Courtney River. And so we got to see one of those events firsthand 2 years ago. So this wasn't last winter, but the winter before that. So the water actually came up over the steel piling wall, and that's what you can see here. At first, we thought that this was going to be a big deal. So I was like on standby. It was over Christmas vacation. It was really crazy. But actually what this showed us is that the site fared really well in these extreme flood conditions. So this was a king tide plus a rain on snow event. So extreme precip event and the conjunction with a king tide. So this actually showed us, you can't really see from here, but I have one more video. This is the water pouring over the wall, which is crazy. And then this is actually a video where you can see, but I'm just going to pause it here. This was actually super interesting because we created the site. We when we were coming up with the restoration design, we wanted to have sea level rise in mind for these extreme events. And so this is an extreme event, but you can see here we still have a meter worth or so of buffer before this berm is actually overtopped. So it was actually showcasing a little bit of the extreme weather and climate resiliency of the site, which was actually really exciting to see real time. So I'll just show you a little video of what that looked like. The water was like pouring into the site. It's wild, but actually didn't really have much impact to the site over time. So it's actually okay. And this was midway through restoration works, as you can kind of tell. So very interesting time overall. So some of the key works are regrading of the site, continued soils testing and sorting and offsite removal, all the monitoring efforts, revegetation with native species. We're going to be installing a little bit of armor and riprap because just south of the site, there is the the sewage pipeline for the whole of Courtney that comes under the river. So we'll be doing a little bit of protection measures at that to make sure that none of the efforts on site lead to any erosion or endangering of that pipeline. And then we'll also be doing the initial planning of the seal piling wall removal, which is really exciting. So the site has been deeply impacted by some new soils removal legislation that have come into play. So there's new soils legislation that came into place March of last year. And some things that weren't previously considered contaminants were listed as contaminants. So things like chloride is now considered a contaminant and really shifts how you are able to move soil. So we've had some challenges with that. But we're actually coming up with some really ingenious ideas of finding matching sites and reusing soils there. So it's actually, even though it's been really challenging and increased the cost a lot of moving the soils off site because we can't take them to a regular landfill or to a regular pit, the soil pit site, it does mean that we're actually repurposing those soils and we're trying to actually repurpose them for habitat restoration purposes. So we're currently in the process of identifying estuarine and coastal sites, so other salty sites like our site, and doing some of the removal. We also found a little bit of residual hydrocarbon and creosote pH contamination in one of the areas. So we're actually just undergoing the removal of that right now. So if you in any way live in Courtney and are by the site, right now we're removing all of the remaining contamination on the site, which is really exciting. And so that will be done in the next week or so. And then we can kind of move forward with soils that don't have an industrial legacy of contamination, but just have some of those naturally occurring contaminants like chloride and a little bit of arsenic as well. But that's at naturally occurring levels. Some heavy metals are quite readily occurring within estuarine environments. So that's what we're seeing at Kus-kus-sum as well. So a little bit about that creosote piling removal. The soils are testing high pHs and you can see some legacy creosote. So it's an expensive piece of work to do, but we've got specialized water treatment, specialized machinery on site so that all the water that's being pumped out of that area so we can get in is actually getting treated. So we're not mobilizing any contamination and we're keeping things really nicely isolated. So it does stay currently outside of our available budget, but we did just shore up a little bit more funding from one of our core funders, BC Shrift, that will allow us to carry out this work before the end of March, which is really exciting. So final goals for the site are to return the lands to the Comox First Nation. So final rematriation is planned after restoration is complete. So after we recontoured and revegetated the whole site, that's when we'll come in, remove the steel piling wall. And then once the land is stable and thriving, that's when we'll come in and return the land to the Comox First Nation. So that's the end goal. It will be post-wall removal in 2025, 2026. So still kind of to be determined when that final date will be. But once the site is establishing well and our monitoring has been successful, that's when we'll be rematriating the site, which is great. And there'll be some long-term management pieces that we do in partnership with Comox First Nation and the city of Courtney. But we're getting close. We're getting close to the end goal, which is really exciting. And there's the site a year and a half ago, and we're even farther than that now. So yeah, thanks for everyone for your attention. It's been great sharing with you this evening. Yeah, I'd be happy to answer any questions at this time.
Wonderful, Caitlin. That was very interesting and a pretty exciting project in a number of ways. But I'm also delighted with how, you know, similar the comparison is between the work being done here on the Courtney River and that in south of the border in the Qwuloolt, I think I've got that correct, estuary. No, Qwuloolt, sorry. Yes. Anyway, very many things to consider. So I wonder if Emma has a few chat questions for us there, perhaps.
Yeah, totally. All right, I have one here that says if there was new regulation regarding the soils, did that mean that you had to go back in and remove more soil? And if so, did that mean the plants had to be removed?
No, we actually didn't have to remove any additional soil. So interestingly enough about the new legislation, because the contamination that we're seeing is actually like naturally occurring levels of things like chloride, which happen because seawater is salty. And so when you have estuarine soils, those soils get salty from seawater. And then arsenic is naturally occurring at varying levels in different sites throughout Vancouver Island. So that's what we're seeing here as well. So all the contamination minus the creosote. So this conversation is kind of minus the creosote. That stuff needs to go because it does pose an ecological risk. But the rest of this stuff is occurring within naturally occurring levels for a site like ours, which is estuarine. So it's considered contaminated or hard to move, if you will, if we're moving it off-site, because if we take salty soils, for example, and we put them on a farm field, you can see how that would maybe pose a risk to that site that's receiving those soils. But if they stay at our site, there's no kind of contamination concerns with them because they're actually very natural levels for a site like ours. It's just if we're introducing them to upland soils where the salt could potentially leach out and get into things like groundwater aquifers and things like that, that would be an issue. So the new regulation is challenging to work through, but it's there for really, really good scientific reasons and really good, strong rationale. So it's just about finding a good coastal property that we can get rid of these soils at and use potentially for other things that also has the kind of same constraints as our site would have, you know, that you're not worried about groundwater contamination, for example, because the site interfaces with the coastal environment. So you're not worried about putting salty soils somewhere where they wouldn't be naturally because coastal soils are naturally salty. So it's just about finding those matching sites and making sure they meet this specific soil characterization issues that we're dealing with. So we're really lucky that we haven't had to go back and like redo or undo any of our past work. We're just kind of dealing with different testing protocols moving forward that were a lot more costly than the ones that we had originally done.